Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Ignition Time. I've been thinking about this because I've been covering this a lot on our channel. How is it that millions of our fellow Americans can afford not to work? Why are they choosing not to work, and how long will this last? What are the implications of this, not just for the economy, but for us and the world around us? Well, folks, here's what's happening. The big consensus, the big theme amongst a lot of workers is I can be choosy. Now, what do I mean by that? I know for a fact that there's a shortage of bus drivers, and many school districts are actually combining routes. Also a lack of servers has caused many restaurants to actually reduce their hours. Now, you may also have noticed that when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the supermarket, the checkout lanes are significantly longer, not just at grocery stores, at supermarkets, but also at pharmacies and when you go to other retailers. Well, folks, the fact is, it is hard to get someone to show up for work. And this is something that very few economists, very few politicians, in fact, you and me, I myself would not have expected this, but this is indeed happening. This is the labor shortage of 2021. And this is a very concerning thing for the economy. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. The big question is, how is it that almost 5 million of our fellow Americans who were working before the pandemic have now decided that, hey, I'm not going to work and I'm essentially going to go without a paycheck. Now, this is not a simple subject. There is no black and white to this. In fact, I believe there's no black and white to anything in life, and the truth hides in the shadows. And you might say, oh, people are flush with cash because of stimulus checks and unemployment benefits. But that is not the entire picture. I do believe that that has something to do with it, but I don't believe that is the only reason. The truth is, under both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, families have received multiple checks from the federal government over the past year and a half. We're talking stimulus checks, we're talking unemployment benefits, we're talking the enhanced child tax credit. A lot of money has indeed been flowing to American families. But on top of that, home values have gone up. The stock market has increased. And essentially people's savings have gone up. If you've been holding some crypto, that seems to be doing pretty well right now. I'm not promoting crypto. I'm just saying that everything seems to be up now. On top of that, a lot of households had another family member that was working. So there was a flow of cash. In fact, the amount of savings that Americans have has substantially increased. And what is even more interesting is that low wage earners had higher savings for the first time in a long time. Here's a graph on your screen, and this is based on the JP Morgan Chase Institute. This represents income quarters based on 2019 household earnings. Now, you'll see the change in median checking account balance since 2019 by household income. Look at those dark colors that represent the bottom quarter of earners, and look at those light colors that represent the top quarter of earners. You'll start to see that when the pandemic hit, everyone's checking account balance, especially those darker colors, started to decline. But in January, and then in March, when everyone got the stimulus checks and the unemployment benefits, look at that dark green portion that represents the bottom quarter of earners, and look at how it jumped up. In other words, the ones with the lowest wages had the most impact and the most benefit. In other words, those who are the most vulnerable amongst us got the most help and got the most assistance by way of stimulus checks and unemployment benefits. For many other individuals, especially the top quarter of earners that are represented in those lighter colors, well, the stimulus checks, the unemployment benefits didn't really move the needle. And this is not surprising, because when you consider that low wage earners are primarily in service industries, in retail, in travel, leisure, entertainment, and hospitality, which ironically were most impacted by the pandemic. That's number one. And number two, also require face-to-face interaction with other customers, and this could increase the risk of getting infected with COVID. Now, on the other hand, the high wage earners, let's go back to that graph that I showed you earlier. The high wage earners that are represented in that light green color, they are the ones who are executives. They're the ones who can work from home. They're the ones who can work remotely, work on a computer, do their work over the phone. They are the ones who make more money, who, by the way, also tend to have college degrees, and they are the ones who essentially bounced back from the pandemic, didn't really need the stimulus checks and unemployment benefits, and they're doing just fine. This is extremely ironic when you consider that the ones who need the most help essentially are the ones who put themselves at the most risk and also are the ones who are in most need of financial support. So what does all of this mean for the American economy? Well, folks, the fact is the American economy has not been kind to workers. Since the 1980s, income for the low wage earners, for those who are the poorest amongst us, have grown very, very slowly. They have not kept up with inflation, with the economic growth, and also life expectancy in the US has grown slowly compared to other countries. Why? We have a lot of problems in our country with drug use, with alcohol use, with chronic pain, and with suicide. And there have been a lot of divorces and essentially depression, anxiety, and stress is on the rise. Here's an interesting quote, and by the way, this comes from a New York Times article. Here's an interesting quote from Rachel Eager, who's 25 years old, who previously worked at an after-school program in New York. She said, many people are realizing that the way things were pre-pandemic were not sustainable and not benefiting them. She also said she's not in a rush. She said this, my financial situation is okay, and I think that is 99% of the reason that I can be choosy about my job prospects. She says she has not been willing to take another job with low pay, no benefits, and little flexibility. Now, the US does not have a labor shortage, but it has a shortage of workers that are willing to accept working conditions that the economy offers. In fact, Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist and Times opinion columnist, has described this trend as, I quote, the revolt of the American worker. In fact, let's show you this article on your screen from Paul Krugman, The Revolt of the American worker. This is a phenomenal article, and I encourage you to check it out. We'll include a link to this article in the description section below. And Betsy Stevenson, who's a University of Michigan professor, calls it the take this job and shove it economy. Pretty incredible. Let's show you this headline on your screen. The US economy's great adjustment. With many low-paying jobs going unfilled, it seems that the COVID crisis has forced a much-needed adjustment in a labor market where workers had long suffered from a decline in bargaining power. But as pandemic support programs end and automation grows, workers face serious risks. So I encourage you to check out both of these articles. Now, I want to be clear. America is not the only country facing labor shortages. The same problem is happening in other countries as well. But the situation is very intense, specifically in the United States. So the big question is, what happens next? Well, folks, it looks like we may have entered a permanent era of tight labor markets. More Americans are choosing not to work and be more precise, be more discerning of where they want to work. And by the way, this includes seniors and baby boomers. Companies will have no choice but to increase pay and improve working conditions. And this is very interesting, folks. I think the pandemic has created a turning point in the American economy. Almost a half century of low wages could come to an end, according to the New York Times, and incomes could grow more rapidly. But the problem here is the low wage earners who don't have much savings and whose savings are about to run out as we get closer to the holidays are the ones who are going to probably suffer the most. And again, they could get the short end of the stick unless they bargain, they negotiate, or they improve their skills. All of these things are easier said than done, because at the end of the day, how do you bargain? How do you negotiate if you're a low wage earner? How do you increase your skills if you don't have the money, the financial capital to increase your skills? In fact, the median cash savings of the bottom quarter of all households has risen by 70% over the past 2 years, but it's only $1,000, according to Fiona Gregg of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. The pandemic programs have ended, and at the end of the day, at some point, all Americans will go back to work. Now, when they go back to work, will they have an advantage, or will employers have an advantage? Because at the end of the day, labor unions have declined. Even though they're striking, they have declined. And more companies are becoming more and more powerful. They're becoming large, they're becoming rich, and more powerful. Also, as more Americans drop out of college, many workers are struggling to keep up with technology, and all of this plays a role. In the end, folks, here's a very important quote from Ben Castleman, who's an economics and business reporter for the New York Times. First, let me show you his tweet before I end this episode with the quote. Here's his tweet. Many progressives have argued there is a shortage of wages, not of workers. But pay has been rising rapidly, especially in lower wage industries, and the hiring difficulties are not limited to low wage sectors. Let's show you this image on your screen, and it shows you the change in hourly earnings since January 2019. So, folks, take a look at this. Hourly earnings are up. There is no question about that hourly earnings are up. And despite that, people are not getting back to work. Let me end with this incredible quote from Ben. He says this: workers are holding out until their savings disappear. Businesses are holding out until their customers disappear. What a way to end this episode of Ignition Time. Let me know what you think. Please click like, please click subscribe, please enable notifications. Thank you so much for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. Take care. Bye.